So some of you might be thinking, boy, like, is he actually thinking he's going to preach today too? Like, it's almost 12. Well, I'll only go for 45 minutes today. I'll be shorter than I normally am. No. Listen, I mentioned that we have at least one guest here, and that was yourself. Because it's funny, like, Alice, I still consider you here. So you're not really a guest. You're kind of like a fixture here, but a personal one of flesh and blood, and that's all good. And so why don't we pray, and then we'll get into some things here. And Lord, again, thank you for the privilege we have to be together. And as we look into your word, I pray that you would move us through every aspect of it. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, in listening to the radio and the TV, been maybe listening to it too much, but there is one thing that I listened to early on Monday morning, and it's completely different from anything that any of us have been listening to and reading about and thinking about and so forth. But on Monday morning, during the radio traffic report that came out of Winnipeg, I heard a street name, and it was Stradbrook. And Stradbrook Street was mentioned, and I think why it was because there was a fender bender that had taken place on it. Nothing too serious, it didn't sound. But the mention of Stradbrook immediately catches my attention, or caught my attention, because that's where Kara and I lived during our first year of marriage, right on Stradbrook. And it was an entertaining enough of a place for sure, and we were only there for a year. And we knew that at one point we'd be moving, we weren't going to be staying there. We knew we would be moving out from there, beginning life elsewhere, settle down, buy a house, have a couple kids, white picket fence, you get the idea, right? And we didn't buy our first home until I think it was around year 6 or year 7. Is that right? Yeah, of our marriage. And so we were renting in those early years, and we did live in some pretty sketchy neighborhoods too. I mentioned the Osborne Village, and well, the Osborne Village is the Osborne Village. And then in Fort St. John, we rented a little house that was owned by the church that we were serving in, so it was a manse. And there's a back alley that separated us from a house that was behind us, and that was a drug house is what that was. And then even for a period of time to the direct, I think, is it be north? But directly beside us, for a period of time, there was another drug house, and it got bulldozed down because the church actually bought the entire property there too, and so that was okay. But and both boys were born during those years, and so there they are. See, there's a picture. There's me in the very background. I wanted you to see me. No, that's the boys. When they were born during that period of time, and I'm telling you, living in those neighborhoods, and especially in the last one that we had been in Fort St. John before moving to the new neighborhood, the owning your own home it started to become something that was really growing within us. The thing was is that we didn't have a whole lot of cash in those days, and what we ended up doing is we actually borrowed money to purchase a city lot in downtown Fort St. John. There was an entire little area there, a block that had lots for sale, and there was 2 that were in there, and we bought one of them, and it really actually helped us because we sold it about a year and a half later for more than double than what we had paid for it. Well, more than double is still the truth, okay? And so and that gave us enough cash so that we would have a down payment for the house that we actually did buy. And I can remember feeling a sense of maybe anxiety, but maybe a little bit of anticipation, a lot of anticipation, in going out on a tour, a real estate tour, to see a compilation of different homes. And it was exciting, because we were considering the prospect of owning our own home, becoming first-time homeowners. And so we're riding this high wave, but this tour, as we went on to this tour, there's only 2 homes, and there was a number of homes that we saw, but there's only 2 that were within our price range. And so then this high wave kind of went all in one afternoon in dejection, right? And however, there was one house from the tour that we had that we really liked. It's just that house was beyond our affordability. But when we entered that home, the owner was still in the home. And it turned out that Kara knew her very well, and her name was Helen Woolley. And there she is. And really she was such a sweet, sweet lady, and she was wanting to sell her home and move on. And she called us later, I don't know if it was the same night but it was shortly thereafter, when we had been in her home looking at it, and she was expressing how badly she wanted us to have her home. And when she was younger, she had made her home available to her church for youth ministry. And so in her knowing what we did and what we were into, well, she became excited and wanted her house, even though she was long gone and moved on elsewhere, to still be used for further youth ministry. But we told her of our financial position. It's beyond us. And then she said, don't you worry. I am going to be in touch with my real estate agent, and we're going to work this thing out. Probably great words for us, maybe not for the real estate agent. And you know what? She did. And this was the house. Let's flip over. That was the house that we were in before we moved back here. And so it was like riding waves. You know, we feeling stuck in one neighborhood. Well, that was a low wave. And then this high wave came when we were touring around and being filled with excitement over the possibility and owning a home. Well, that was really exciting until we realized that we couldn't afford it and we were going to stay in the neighborhood we were in, another low wave. And then Helen Woolley's new news that things were being worked out for her, where you could purchase the home and back up onto a high wave. And we finally did it. We bought our own home. But in time, we found that these monthly payments of mortgages and bills and so forth, they're beginning to pinch really hard. And you know something, that was really bugging me. That was really stressing me out. We had finally gotten out from where we were, only to feel that we could lose this place if we couldn't meet our bills. And that was really hard to think about. And you know what's kind of hard on the pride too? And then Karis had suggested, well, why don't we get a boarder? That really didn't excite me at all. Yeah, the basement was basically set up for that anyway, but I was not keen on that. But what could we do? And so we got a boarder. We had a boarder for a brief period of time because he came in. You know, he was actually all right. Young fella came in. He was sometimes late on his payments, but you know, it was okay. We got along well, and it turned out being good. But he moved on, and so we had another young fella come in, and that turned out to be pretty good too. But you know, he moved on too. And then we got into adult exchange students who were coming to Canada to learn English, and I'm telling you, that was really fun. A lot of fun. And we had 2 Chinese exchange students, a Colombian student, a Japanese student, and a Korean student, not all at the same time, but it gives you an idea. It gives you an idea of how long we had kind of been in this for. And the top one was one of the first Chinese students we had. I think she was the second one, Cherry. I couldn't even tell you her real name, because some of them get English names, and so she chose Cherry, because their Chinese names are just a little bit too beyond us, right? And then he told me, and Cherry is just tiny, but he told me is scrunched down, and she's still nearly as tall as Kara. So so she's a little taller than Kara. I just thought I'd point it out. And but it was so much fun in that period of time. And so when I think back, in the middle of stressing out during those first few months of being first-time homeowners, not really being able to see what lied ahead for us all here, and in my mind, I couldn't help but wrestle through a few things here. And you know, mainly like, God, why would we move here only to be faced with the possibility of having to let it all go? I don't like this very much. And I say we, but it's, I think probably more me. Perhaps. Kara is probably more open to all this than I was. I say probably because I don't want to go all the way there and say she was. And, you know, in this whole idea, maybe it was happening just to have a little bit more of an open heart and an open home. Because the relationships, the friendships made with those kids, with those exchange kids too, we still cherish those memories made with them. And they will always be golden years. And I know the golden years aren't supposed to happen until I'm a little older yet, until I get my brown envelope, I suppose. But those were golden years. But perhaps the struggle to keep our heads above water financially, without that struggle, I might not have been open to the experience of a boarder at all, and our family would have missed out on the experience of knowing each of those young people who had lived with us at various times. And we're not only given a means or provided with a means to make our mortgage payments, but we were given lifetime friends. And I wouldn't want to trade that blessing for anything. And this is what I was reminded of when reading through our Old Testament reading of Israel moving at a snail's pace through a desert. And listen, I would rather go through what Kara and I had gone through in our first home experience rather than travel through a desert with a massive group of people with little means to sustain themselves. Oh gosh, you know, a desert life in the ancient world, I can only imagine. And that's all I can do. Because when I think of a desert, I think of sparsity, and I think of desolation, hot by day, cold by night, and I wonder how much of this group of people would have resembled like a refugee city or a refugee camp, a camp that was as a nomadic city. And I'm sure that the elements were so harsh that it was even beyond harsh, too harsh for some of the people that were living within it. I wouldn't have wanted to have, that is an experience that I wouldn't want to own. And I think that it is without question that in extreme situations where desperation grows to a height, that things become very dangerous. I think we're getting just a sniff of it in this past week. Israel was lacking water and they were lacking food, and when hungry and when tired, the unthinkable can enter the mind. Rationality can wane. And it would seem that this was Israel's experience. And they come before Moses, and that confrontation was fierce. It was no small thing. We have a bit of a problem we want to talk about. Oh, it was way beyond that. And Moses even says, like, he feels that his life is being threatened here. And he says, what am I going to do with this people? What shall I do with them? Because they're ready to stone me. And what's interesting, though, is to retrace their steps, because it doesn't seem that it was really that long ago when they were still enslaved or just had been recently enslaved in Egypt, longing for release and to become a people, or to be a people of their own land and to be a people of their own. And Moses, it would seem to me, enters the picture in this time of history in a divine kind of way. And if you go right back to his beginnings, he's a Hebrew baby born during a time when all Hebrew baby boys were being snuffed out from existence. And Moses escapes that fate, and he not only escaped it, but he's actually growing up in an Egyptian palace, even raised by his very own mother, and that's divine in and of itself. And it was her who had given him up and hoped for his survival. And Moses understands the Egyptian culture, the Egyptian way of life very well. And God calls him back to Egypt after he had been away for a long period of time, because it was now time. It was time for Israel to leave Egypt. And Moses' presence back in Egypt would have been to the Hebrews like a breath of fresh air. It would have been hope that was becoming realized. And he pleads for the release of the Hebrews. And we know the story. Pharaoh doesn't budge. And there's a series of 10 plagues. Relentless disaster falls upon Egypt until Pharaoh relents. And he doesn't just allow them to go, but he actually commands them, just get out of here. Go. And these 10 plagues were clearly understood as pressure being applied by God to persuade Pharaoh to not only let them go, but also to show that there is a God. There is a God in Israel. There is the God of Israel. And so they're released. And here they are. They're riding a high wave now, right? A high wave of elation. But then they discovered that they were being chased by the Egyptian army. Pharaoh had changed his mind yet again and was after them with his army to bring them back to Egypt. And what could be worse if you're a Hebrew in that group, knowing that you're being chased now, to be brought back where? Well, back to Egypt, and to do what? Well, back into slavery. And they are at the end of the road, running, literally at the end of the road. There is this sea that's in front of them, the Red Sea, but the waters part, and we know that story, and they walk through dry ground to the other side, and once on the other side, the water comes back down, and they're safe. But their pursuers are not. And they're at the bottom of the Red Sea. And it's another miraculous divine intervention here. And this is their sojourn so far. And now here we are in our Old Testament reading. They're now in a desert, and they come to a place where they're hit by yet another wave that just feels to be too much for them. And they're hungry, and they're thirsty, and they fear for their survival. And at times had even expressed this longing to be back in Egypt. And you wonder, how can that be? Especially when looking back at their footsteps, from where they had come from, and from what they had only recently experienced. And the only thing I can say is this, is that learning, whether you're a Hebrew or whether you're a Canadian or whether you're whomever you are, learning to trust is really hard. And I think there are a lot of things, there's a lot of things I can remember from being a younger parent. And one of the things I think that I missed the most was observing the child innocence of faith. Children just don't seem to have the same issues of trust as we do when we grow older. And honestly, I think I'm envious of this. And I don't think that there have ever been two people who have trusted Kara or I more than our boys from when they were little. That's changed a little bit, but from when they were little. And it felt pretty good. And it would be true too, that when they're little, they do not perceive the magnitude of certain situations. They didn't have the life experience to understand some of the things that we do as we grow older. But I'm telling you, there is something that we can learn from our children. There really is. And it would be this. Proverbs, you're familiar with this one. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to go. And you see, we all go through desert seasons and we have these desert experiences in life, and there's enough life experience in this room to know that that's true. We go through one thing, whatever it is, and it was hard, but we made it through, and sometimes we look back and we wonder, how in the wide world did I ever make it through that? And we can be grateful that we made it through to the other side too. It's just that once on the other side, it seems that there's another wave just waiting to roll in. And we go through all the emotions of tension and stress all over again. And there will always be stress and tension in life, and there will always be yet another wave to endure, another desert experience to live through. Learning to trust with all of our heart, it isn't about finding our way to this place of absence of conflict or of difficulty or of stress. Learning to trust is more about, I think, seeing the resources that do exist within a harsh, desolate, hard desert. And the Israelites were learning this. Some of them anyway, when hungry, food was provided for them, right? And it was manna, and provided for all of them, even their livestock. And when they cried out for meat, and they got quail, and when thirsty, they got water from a rock of all places. God provided water to drink from a rock, and it's quite a contrast, isn't it, when you consider, or when you think that the water was undrinkable back in Egypt when the Nile turned blood red. Who is the provider? And through God, the desert had its gifts to be discovered, and so then metaphorically, then for us, the deserts in our lives are challenged, and they're not to be minimized. We go through things that are serious, but there will always be resources within our deserts provided to us by God to pull us through to the other side. It'll always be there, and to sustain us for yet one more time. God always provides a way. He has enough water for all who are thirsty. He's got enough water for all who are weak. Like the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan woman, and there was real enmity between Jews and Samaritans. A real intense hatred. Samaritans were half-Jews who had intermingled with Assyrians years ago, and Assyrians were bitter enemies of the Jews, and they had enslaved the Jews during an awful period of exile, which was of extreme violence and dominance. And the hatred between these two peoples was so great and so bad that when Jews had to travel either north or south, they would choose to go around Samaria. Here, flip to the next one, Joe. There's Samaria. If they're going either north or south, they would go around the country of Samaria just to avoid it, even if it meant adding miles or days to their journey. And they shared some foundational history, but man, that was it. And Jesus decides to travel right through Samaritan country, despite the dangers that it would pose. And they arrive at a well, and the disciples head on into the city or into a village to get some food. And so Jesus is alone by this well when along comes the Samaritan woman. And surprisingly to her, Jesus initiates a conversation with her by asking for a drink. And their conversation, gosh, there's so much to unpack here, but we'll be brief. Their conversation moves to living water. And this Samaritan woman is skeptical and suspicious over who this fellow actually is. And she questions him about who he really is. This whole conversation of water and living water. And she says, well, this well here that we're drawing water from, it came from none other than Jacob, one of our patriarchs. Who are you to him? And as that conversation goes, and as they talk back and forth, her demeanor begins to shift as it moves along. And Jesus offers her living water. Water that will quench an eternal thirst, and where there's peace and where there's rest, and it's given by a personal and relational God who is everywhere, who is omnipresent. And he could be found and discovered not only in temples of worship, but everywhere you would go. All you had to do was open your eyes and seek. And the honest seeker would find him. And this resonated with that Samaritan woman. Her life was hard. And Jesus knows her pain. And he even goes to that place. And he asks her, go get your husband. And she replies, I don't have a husband. And Jesus then shows that he's already in the know on that one too, by describing her lengthy marital history that was undoubtedly unhappy. But Jesus affirms her. and he accepts her, and he loves her. And the love of God gives her this fresh new start and this whole new outlook. She's riding a high wave now through being told that God the Father saw her and cared for her, and that he could be trusted by her and would always be there for her. And she's elated over this good news. She embraces it because she was told that she was good enough. She was told that she was accepted. And she saw Jesus to be the one who is called a Christ, the long prophesied of Messiah that she had known history about. One who would come and who would make all things new. One who would mend broken hearts. One who would even mend broken relationships, even where there was intense racial division. The Samaritan goes back, the woman goes into the city people come out, and they embrace Jesus. They're overjoyed with them, and they're longing for peace and for division to end too. And so then what does this all tell you and I then? I hope what we are seeing is that there is always water to be found in all of our personal deserts of life. There's always gifts to be found in the desert of our soul. And those gifts of discovery, they'll come directly from the hand of God. And listen, I know that our desert experiences are uncomfortable. But through each experience, if we're willing to listen, we will learn more and more. And in time, I think we'll come to the place to realize exactly what the Apostle Paul stated in our New Testament reading. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Given to us, all of us as living water, if you will. And given to us in an array of new and wonderful ways and awesome ways. And you know what? Honestly, it's taking some time for me. But slowly, I'm learning this little by little and day by day. I'm learning to lean. And often finding and discovering more than I ever thought would be. Often discovering more than I dreamed would be. And that song, that hymn, learning to lean. Learning to lean. You know that song? I'm learning to lean on Jesus and finding more power than I'd ever dreamed. I'm learning to lean on Jesus. Let's stand and sing that in closing.